Good afternoon. Welcome to the Therapeutics session. The way we have organized this session is that I will take about 7 to 8 minutes to just lay out some big picture considerations for you. Then we'll introduce the panel, and then Lisa will moderate the panel discussion for us. Okay? So to begin, from the tone of the discussion at this meeting, it's clear that all of us, you are in the thick of your entrepreneurial adventures, and you have a lot of tactical questions and specific questions related to your own enterprises that you want to ask. But it's always helpful to keep the big picture in mind, because if your entrepreneurial venture is going to be around anything more than a year or 2 years, for sure you'll be impacted by the big picture. So I thought I'll just start by laying out what I consider to be the big drivers of entrepreneurship today in life sciences. First, foremost, we know it bears repeating again, big pharma research has fallen and can't get up. It's not because they're not smart people in big pharma. Individually, everybody is smart, but the way the organizations have evolved, the collective wisdom is less than the sum of the individual people. Unfortunately, this is not a criticism of people, it's not even a criticism of the structure and processes actually, because those structure and processes are needed for global development and global commercial organization. But what that means is that this is an irreversible change, that big pharma research and early development cannot deliver the type of pipeline that's needed to sustain pharmaceutical industry. I consider that an opportunity. Most people consider that a big sign of worry, and I'll try to lay out for you why I think that's an opportunity. We heard a lot yesterday. Since 2008 financial crisis, VCs are under stress, money is tight, they can't raise funds, can't sustain their companies for the long term. Once again, I don't think this is a reason to panic. I liken it to the internet bubble of the late 90s. Any company could put .com in front of its name and raise a ton of money, do an IPO, get more money, and while not making anything useful. The collapse of internet bubble did not stop Facebook and Google from rising and doing what they do. And I actually think in the long run, when we look back, this financial crisis that led to the VC catastrophe would have been a positive for our industry, because too many bad companies, junk science, non-tenable hypotheses were getting funded. The quality that's available today is far greater, actually, and will continue to be so. And I like to say this will separate the pretenders from the contenders. Everybody was claiming to be a successful VC, 10x, 20x return. Now we are in the real world. One thing that has changed, the two things I just outlined, they do lead to a different spectrum of opportunities for VCs. Most of you are in early stage companies. When VCs have phase 3 opportunities available to them to invest tens of millions of dollars with multi-X return for a 70% or 80% probability of success, you can fully understand why they don't want to invest $1 million or $500,000 in each of you for a 1 in 1,000 chance of succeeding. Okay, so I'm sure we'll get into discussion more as we go through the panel discussion. Complexity of drug development will be the topic throughout, so I won't talk much at this time. And the changing global regulatory landscape, especially as medicine becomes more personalized and markets become more niche, we need to really think about the global regulatory landscape and not just what's needed for US and top 5 European. So based on what I just outlined, it will not be a surprise to you if I say that we have actually not seen the best of possibilities for entrepreneurship. The golden age of innovation is yet to come, and the major drivers from my perspective are listed here. Rapid advances in our understanding of molecular basis of health and disease, human genome sequence, proteomics, evolution, systems biology, a whole plethora of other things. I've not tried to be comprehensive about them. Novel tools available to us. Preclinical models are changing. Discovery platforms, chemistry platforms, all sorts of novel biological platforms available to us. New modalities of therapy. Treatment is no longer just small molecule tablets or antibodies, but there are a whole host of things I would call them, that we never thought were actually treatments, that are very much either already here or will be here shortly with reasonable certainty. Things such as cell therapy, such as therapeutic cancer vaccines, such as oncolytic viruses, and a whole host of novel protein scaffolds. But I think one thing that really is fundamental to longer-term health of entrepreneurship is actually the global expansion of entrepreneurship. As money in the Western world dries up a bit, there's no question that the Eastern world is starting to move. So far, there have been primarily people who have benefited from outsourcing of more service type of things, but increasingly they'll do more value-added things. And with the mindset that's coming there and the resources coming, we can fully expect entrepreneurship will no longer be the sole domain of the Western world, and this offers great opportunities. Very briefly, just a couple of high-level points I want to make before we open up for discussion. Anytime we think of a new drug developing a new drug, whether it's big pharma or anywhere else, we always talk about the end is the beginning, okay? Which means label is the driver, call it target product profile, or whatever you choose to call it. For people such as yourself and everybody else in this meeting, the real question is exit is the driver. It's very unlikely any of you will take something from an innovative concept all the way to a product. So you have to think all along the way, where is my exits? And as you see from the picture here, exit can happen any of these places. Exit is not necessarily a product, it's not necessarily NDA filing, it's not even necessarily a proof of concept. Depending on the drug, target, or therapeutic platform you are working on, exit can happen even before you ever file an IND. And the examples of each one of these and highly successful example. And I like to call it the target inflection profile, an inflection point where either the science inflects to the next meaningful step, and the corollary of that is exit for the company or partner or major partnership for the company. Okay? Shown on the upper part of this slide is the usual drug development paradigm, which is the very traditional model for industry: new medicine proposal, target validation, lead identification, lead optimization, EIH enabling preclinical studies, phase 1, 2, 3. That's standard drug development. As you think about your label and your exit, you have to see where you are in that spectrum and realize what's in the bottom half of the slide, which I won't go through in the interest of time, but every one of those places, there are pitfalls. I've never met an entrepreneur, I do oncology mostly, I've never met an entrepreneur who didn't think their drug was going to cure some cancer, except when you start looking at each of these steps, your models will be wrong, your data will be wrong. So you have to always be cross-checking and cross-validating, speaking with the experts, getting independent validation of data, and really asking the devil's advocate questions. Okay. One other point to mention before I set the stage for the panel is the issue of biomarkers. We are very much evolving to the era of personalized medicine. We had a great discussion from Christine and others in the panel just before lunch about biomarkers. The mistake I think most people have made, and I believe still continue to make, is that they think diagnostics as being separate from drug development. Because if you really follow the model of companion diagnostic, the biomarker work needs to start almost at the same time as the drug discovery process starts. And you can see the cycle of companion diagnostics is almost as long in many ways to validate. Not all markers, individual markers are different, but we need to think about that. And I think the great symbol of that we haven't quite made this mental switch yet is that in the room next to us, there's a diagnostics panel going on. And as enlightened as Kaufman Foundation is, even they sort of set it up. Sorry, Lisa. We are being bad to our host. But I think it's important to understand why it happens, and we can discuss, okay? So there's room for improvement every step of the way, okay? Again, I'll not go through the details of this slide, but what we have to do is be smart about it. Resources are tight, but if you're smart about it, believe it or not, money is there if your idea is good, and people are there to help you along the way, to help with all of these components at preclinical stage, clinical development stage, and the enabling tools that you will need along the way. So just to introduce the panel now, I'm a medical oncologist by training. I spent half my career in academia at MD Anderson and Memorial Sloan Kettering. Primary specialty was breast cancer. Half my career was in industry, Lilly and Roche. I was head of Roche Oncology from 2001 to 2008. And since then, I've been an independent consultant and have had the privilege of being on the boards of some companies that have done well, largely thanks to the work of the scientists and entrepreneurs in them. Michael Beckloff, sitting at my extreme left, is president of Beckloff Associates, which is a scientific and regulatory consulting group of Cardinal Health Specialty Solutions. He's a big-time Jayhawks fan, he tells us, and a graduate of University of Kansas. You see? Michael, you should.
What sport is that?
And has 30-plus years experience in scientific regulatory drug development. Christine introduced herself in the last session. I believe most of you were there. She has quite a stellar career as an entrepreneur, and as she told us, is working on some really interesting things. Lisa will moderate our panel discussion, so I'll turn it over to her, and she'll take us through your questions.
Yeah. So what we'd like to do, I mean, clearly we've learned over the last couple of days that there are more questions that we can ever get to. And we'd like to run this session with more of an opportunity for you guys to ask those questions than for us simply to talk to you. But what I'd love to do is give, since you've heard from Kapil, give Christine and Michael maybe just an opportunity to say a couple of things about their great experiences or the most horrid experiences that they've had in making decisions about clinical or regulatory strategy where they had to see main pivots. And an example I would love to hear from you guys if either one of you have it. Mike, I think you know John McBride, don't you? Mm-hmm. And I think John is still living the wonderful opportunity of being the only guy that has sold a company with the fewest amount of patients having ever been dosed and the shorter cycle time from starting to selling a company.
Wait a minute, how many patients did you get?
Really few, really few. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I knew you would ask that question. But I think still, people don't talk about those opportunities of, your strategy literally being, whether it's bridging studies or whatever ways in which you can exit. And one of the things that I think some of you, I know you heard this yesterday, might have missed is when we were having our founding team discussions, and a lot of the people that are in this room are founders. One of the things that we said that's really important, especially in therapeutics, probably more so than anywhere else, is thinking about what are you really trying to accomplish in the long term? Is this, are you really trying to get this through kind of a proof of concept because it really shouldn't be a company, it should be something that you license out, or you really think this is, an opportunity to do multiple opportunities that can turn into a company. So could you both just talk to us about your experiences there, like best, worst case scenarios that you've seen?
All right. So the worst case scenario, probably most people are familiar in the room with. By the way, do we have anybody from Big Pharma in the room? Okay. So what just asking a question. So going back to my experience working for Big Pharma, what I haven't mentioned, when I was part of Merck, I looked after Vioxx commercialization worldwide.
And I want to remind you that we do have cameras.
Yes.
Okay.
So you wanted to, are there any attorneys in the room? No.
No, but
Right.
This will be on video, so.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's a good reminder. Obviously, one of the worst experiences in my career was actually a decision by the company to take the drug off the market. Vioxx at the time. This was not regulatory driven, by the way. A lot of people forget about that with all the press noise we had. And creating basically a void in the market. I think a lot of pharmaceutical companies did not like Merck after that decision because it created a regulatory environment which was really, really tough for other companies to pursue drugs in the field of pain and inflammation. So that was one of the worst experiences I had. And by the way, and I know this is videotaped, I still believe the drug should be on the market appropriately labeled with a black box warning or whatever. So the best regulatory experience, and I think entrepreneurs are going to enjoy that, was actually with a small company. So my first company I founded, Taurus Biomedical, again, it's a drug-device combination product, currently in phase 2B development for interstitial cystitis. Interstitial cystitis didn't get any approval since, I think it was 1991 or 93. So the FDA identified that particular patient population as in need of new therapies. So if you can carve out such a market and you have really good science, you work with experienced regulatory consultant, or if you can hire an experienced regulatory team, and you have early discussions with the FDA, and you have a highly innovative, disruptive technology, you have actually a good chance that the FDA may help you. Yes, I'm saying help you to get something faster into the clinic. And that was actually the case with Taurus Biomedical. We were, from the time we licensed some animal device out of MIT through phase 1 in 18 months. And that's a drug-device combination product, so not just a device. And without the FDA actually helping us, cutting down the preclinical program, giving us at least a chance to apply for accelerated approval by even looking at phase 2B as a final registration trial, that wouldn't have been possible. So a little thing I have to add that the FDA likes innovation. They like actually working with small companies. There are a lot of big companies who have a bad track record with the agency, actually. So that might actually work in your favor.
Well, you know, I've had the good fortune of working with lots and lots of startups over the years, small companies, probably like many of yours, and I do have some of my favorite success stories, and then some of the failures and sort of trauma that's encompassed some of those development programs. But I think, and I think it's really interesting that Christine says that you know, there's actually a way to develop a relationship with the FDA and leverage that relationship to move your product through the process faster, which has been my experience actually, and how we always approach the problems. But I think for us, you know, my maybe favorite success story is about a very small product for an orphan product for apnea of prematurity that we were able to get approved with just an 89 patient study, and allowed the company to enjoy 7 years of exclusivity in orphan status, and then sell the product to a large pharma company and have a very nice exit. So you know, there's some, that's my favorite. I don't know if my patient population's small. I don't know if I've got John's timeline, but it took us a few years to get that done. But I have other stories that are probably more the rule of how things go with small companies as compared to maybe that story, which is the exception to the rule. But you know, we have many companies that really look at things from a, you know, this is my baby kind of program. I'm not going to let go of it, and sort of languish for years and years, and not putting the right development programs in place. And have an example of a company. While I've got examples of this smaller company that got approval in maybe 3 or 4 years, I've also got examples of disruptive technologies that didn't, where the appropriate regulatory strategies and scientific strategies weren't implemented, and the technology has been sitting on the shelf for 10 years, and you know, funding comes in as kind of light bill money, and the technology just languishes in the development process. So 10+ years, and so momentum's lost, new technologies come along, you know, it just a general loss of interest in the investment community, because the longer you're out there pitching your technology and product, the longer the teeth get, right? And so it's a slow process, and the VC community, and I'd be interested in input from others. I mean, it's a pretty small community that's pretty well connected, that sort of talks a lot, and so after a while, no one's interested. So that's those are kind of my
Mike,
saddest
can
stories.
you talk about, as an example, the so why does that happen? I mean, obviously you've had multiple experience where, as you said, they're not putting together the right regulatory strategy. Why not?
Well, you know, it was interesting in the last panel, you know, it came up that seek good advice and counsel. And I think so many times entrepreneurial companies are strapped for cash, and they try to sort of band-aid together things, and they really don't get the right kind of advice that they need. And to me, after having done this for a while, there's a sort of a sequence of events. It's kind of like blocking and tackling in football. There's just some basic fundamentals that have to be accomplished. And those are putting together a reasonable development plan, attacking chemistry and manufacturing issues early and non-clinical issues. And I think it's great advice from Kapil to think about the label, you know, because that's what your product's going to be approved on. So I think if you can get those items in place, then you start to build value for the product, and you start to generate interest because people that are looking at your technologies see that you have a plan and a way to move forward. And that's enough probably for now. But
Yeah. How about you, Kapil? Do you want to throw out a couple of best or worst case scenarios, and then we'll open it up to the audience?
Sure. Yeah, I think the best case are that these two companies that were acquired within the past year or so, Micromet and BioVax. BioVax, because both of those are conceptually very simple, but with a 30-year history of failures. BioVax is oncolytic virus, and people have been working on oncolytic virus for 30 years. Nobody could make it work. And the difference was, in this case, the company did some modifications to the virus, and which led to uninjected tumor lesions shrinking. Most people, even the big pharma heads to this date, have not really grasped the true significance of that, and they were totally shocked when Amgen bought the company for $1 billion. Because in effect, this transforms the technology from being an oncolytic virus that you're using a virus to lyse tumors, but actually to make a vaccine. So it's a personalized vaccine that you're picking off the shelf. So that was interesting. On the opposite side of it is Micromet, which works on bispecific antibodies. Bispecific antibodies have been out for 30 years. People have been working on it. Nobody could make it work. So this company, Micromet, has been in existence since '92. They were doing other things. Around 2003-04, they decided to make bispecific antibodies, which is one side recognizing a tumor antigen, the other has CD3, which brings T cells. So the idea is now you convert every T cell in the body into a killer cell, so you don't need, not restricted by the immunologic repertoire. Both of these companies were almost bankrupt at various times. One couldn't get funding at the end of phase 2 until some VCs got convinced it's real, and those VCs were rewarded 18 months later with a 6x return, more or less. And the other one had to engineer a reverse merger with CancerVax, which is a vaccine company that failed in phase 3 despite having a very promising vaccine. So this is not to say everything will be successful, but the key is if the idea is smart, and you think about why the previous generations of vaccines or bispecific or anything else failed, eventually there is progress. So progress is not always because one day apple falls on somebody's head and you make up a great law. Progress happens, especially in biology as opposed to physics, through incremental improvements, conceptual incremental understanding from every last failure.
Okay. So open it up for questions.
Hi, so this question goes to sort of generating the clinical development plan. If you're a small company and you're largely focused in the US, but your value might actually be the global market, and you're planning on partnering in phase 2, when do you start considering global clinical trials? Because that's a big cost, and if you're trying to keep it simple and keep it clean, I would just like to throw that out to the panel in terms of what's critical and what's nice to have.
Christine, one second.
Yeah.
So I would actually throw probably a question back. Have you considered to go ex-US immediately? Sometimes that's an advantage even in terms of cost savings and in terms of regulatory approval. It is very indication specific. So it could be actually, if you look at Canada and US, it's probably the most expensive countries to run clinical trials. So you have to be careful, obviously indication specific, and then you need to look at your patient population and make sure that, you know, US patients are equal to, let's say, Eastern European patients or South American patients. But if you look at pharma, they run a lot of their trials in Eastern Europe and Latin America for those reasons.
But did you get your answer of, so, I mean, I think what you heard from her is you're probably going to do your early stage studies, but her, I think, question then was.
Was more to the value if you're trying to attract a partner and you've only got data in one country area.
Right.
You know, so what country should potentially do that? You know, so.
Or does that matter? Yeah, her question was, you know, if I just do trials, as an example, in Latin America, tell me if this is right, if I just do trials in Latin America, am I going to have trouble when I want to go, you know, make a partnership with Novartis, et cetera? I think the answer is no, but I'll let you guys.
So, you know, if you look at sort of how can you manage this big issue, money and time and distance, which is huge because you have to go monitor studies and so on. So you may look at your regulatory strategy and say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and put an IND in place with the FDA, but I may go outside of the U.S. to do studies for whatever patient populations, whatever reason that might be, so that you can kind of take a small sort of incremental approach to accomplishing those goals concurrently. I think, you know, phase 1 and early phase 2, and I'd be interested in input from you all, but you know, those are pretty manageable, I think, outside of the United States when it comes to, you know, sort of the same types of patient populations and characteristics. As you move further into phase 2 and phase 3, where the standards of care sort of diverge, then you have to kind of manage that. So incrementally, how will you add value? Safety in phase 1, and you may get that phase 1 data outside the United States, and maybe a small 2A study somewhere that will help add value, where you're not trying to sort of eat the whole elephant, you know, at once.
But would you guys also comment on, I mean, I think anyone that's been in industry for any length of time also has the horror stories of running trials in various parts of the world that you then have to throw away. Could you just comment on that?
Yeah, so I think the right answer, as you're sort of hearing, is depends on the drug, depends on therapeutic area, depends on patient population. There's nothing wrong with doing the first-in-man studies outside US or Western Europe fundamentally, okay? Phase 3 studies, as you know, routinely these days, at least in indications like oncology, bulk of the accrual is coming ex-US, because US first-line patients sort of don't exist anymore in major centers. So the key with the initial trials, what you don't want is to be surprised. The most important thing is an investigator who believes in the concept of what you're trying to do and the drug candidate is probably more crucial than anything else. Cost considerations come into play. A lot of people are going to Ukraine. If you're going to go to Ukraine phase 1, pick your site and CRO carefully. Australia and New Zealand, great places to do healthy volunteer study. You don't need to get into line for 6 months. India, China opening up. The key is, I get to the thrust of your question. If you have treated 300 patients in your development plan and not one patient has been treated in the US or Western Europe, yes, I think you have a bit of a challenge in partnership. You don't want to end up there, but a given trial, 15, 30, 50 patients can be anywhere in the world. If the data are verifiable, you're fine. And in part, that should be driven by when you think your exit is. From a horror story perspective, we'll just relate one thing. Sorry, my examples will be all oncology because pretty much that's what I do, but the illustration is general. Roche had acquired a company, Boehringer, and inherited a program on a bisphosphonate called ibandronate. Ibandronate is just like any other bisphosphonate. A phase 3 trial had completed accrual, and it was a sort of positive trial. The problem was when because Boehringer had a lot of patients from Russia, and believe it or not, in Siberia, and the trial was bisphosphonates. The main endpoint was, does patient develop skeletal-related events, i.e. bone fractures, or do they need radiation for metastatic breast cancer? So guess what they do in Russia, at least in those days? As soon as the patient came in with metastatic breast cancer, they radiated the spine, pelvis, and sternum and skull and sent the patient home for a few months. So all patients from Russia met an endpoint on day one, essentially, before they ever got on a study. So, and actually to this day, Bandronate is not registered. So it's a good example of something that you need to know what the treatment patterns are, what the standards of care are, or you pay a high price at the end. The key always is look at the end, what you need to do to either sell the drug to a regulator or a partner, and start doing your box check. Which are the most crucial pieces of information I must get right, otherwise I will not get to my endpoint.
So personalized medicine is all done in good concept, but for someone making a drug in the personalized medicine space, it's a nightmare, right? I mean, whatever indication you look at, you're going to have a plethora of conditions and variants and biomarkers and responses. And so how is an emerging company going to be able to say, I'm in personalized medicine, apart from the tag personalized medicine, which has some appeal, in reality, in this changing environment, how are they going to survive?
We should probably let Christine start with that because she's dealing with something like that right now.
Well, in our case, and I'm speaking about Intica now, not my first company, current company, the science is helping us. So we are not in a position where we had therapeutics and then try to find a biomarker. That can be very long and costly, to your point. And even big pharma is struggling with that. So I guess you have to be careful as an entrepreneur that you don't end up in that box if you believe that the market really demands and I guess that's indication specific, a specific and predictive marker. In our case, we detected or we discovered a novel target. And our companion diagnostic basically detects the target. Let's see, that's the cell, here's the target, it's present. Detects the target, and we're also treating the target. So that's very, very predictive. It's not some sort of mutation downstream. And I think that's probably a higher value proposition also to payers. I actually had a discussion with one payer about this last week. So they're going to look at your biomarker and see how predictive it is in terms of treatment. They're also going to look at if the biomarker is really ordered by physicians. And they will make their coverage decisions and reimbursement decisions based upon those criteria. I don't know if that's helpful, but you really have to be careful with what biomarkers to pick.
So just to address a little bit further on your question, I think the key to approaching personalized medicine is not to take it as something that we have to solve the whole puzzle at one time. And we're not even talking, personalized medicine doesn't mean a given drug or even a given drug combination for each patient. By and large, when we talk personalized medicine today, we're talking about enrichment strategies. Primarily eliminating patients who are certain not to benefit from a drug, device, or intervention. So on a relative basis, your drug looks better. So, and it should not be thought of as a way, actually, I did hear yesterday something that I do disagree with, I think, so it's worth putting it on the table in case people want to react to that somehow personalized medicine will save costs and make healthcare cheaper. I think it's going to be exactly the opposite. Because if anybody thinks personalized medicine will make healthcare costs cheaper, they have no understanding of how pharma pricing is done. Okay, so the reality is personalized medicine will bring great benefit to patients, great benefit to society, but it will be an expensive model of healthcare delivery, and we should be under no illusion it will be otherwise.
So my question relates to the slide that you presented, Kapil, earlier. You talked about target product profile, TPP. You also talked about TIP, the inflection point. As you look at inflection point, a lot of people talk about phase 2 proof of concept. And one of the questions I have for all three of you, what is the proof of concept in your mind? Doesn't it depend on the product? Doesn't it depend on the technology? And it's a discovery platform, therapeutic platform versus a a orphan disease indication, which phase 2 is a proof of concept as well as an approval process, and you have a product to market.
Yes. Michael, would you like to start?
So I think that as we move forward, just a straight ahead answer on the proof of concept. I think it's a fair safety assessment and some compelling efficacy, preliminary efficacy, and that would be what I would see as an inflection point for a standard proof of concept somewhere in phase 2, and that's what we would work for. But as we are developing these programs, we're kind of answering all these questions along the way and sort of filling those gaps, and sometimes they can't be filled because the science doesn't prove itself out, but we're always filling the gaps so that that's part of the proof of concept, the package that you've put together, and it's rugged and robust, and that it becomes valuable that way, or more valuable.
So here's some positive news. To figure out what your value inflection points are doesn't require a lot of capital. You get your team together and you build a straw man, what you believe, what your team believes. I'm sure there are some experienced people there, and your advisors looking at the indication area, the drug, etc., and then defining what the value inflection points are. And those you're going to take to your customers, i.e. the people you're going to exit in the future. And you're not selling, you're just introducing yourself, and you have a good discussion with them what they would like to see. And that is probably going to vary very, very much, as you were saying, based upon what product you have and what the indication is. So in our case, oncology, novel targeted therapy with companion diagnostic right from the get-go, you see collaborations very, very early in preclinical. We talked to about 10 companies who give us very similar feedback in terms of what milestones they want to see, and they're all preclinical, by the way. Mm-hmm. If you have a product in depression, you probably get very different feedback. In fact, I was testing one out of a different university. I was fascinated by it and had some discussions with former pharma colleagues, and the feedback I got there is, oh yeah, we want to see a large randomized clinical trial. So that requires a little bit more capital to get there. So do your homework, take it to your customers. It's free. That's for free. It's just networking.
So something which has been very interesting in both the comments now and earlier on over the last day and a half have been most of the discussion regarding trials and conversation with agencies has been the very standard classical paradigm over the last 50 years, phase 1, 2, 3. But over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of discussion about changing the modality of clinical trials, using more adaptive designs, and trying to find more innovative ways to approach your patient populations, particularly in areas like oncology. Have you seen anyone successfully have conversations with either an agency or with a partner where upfront the conversation has stated, we would like to do these novel type of clinical trial designs where we're going to have an adaptive phase 1, 2, and try and register off of a combined endpoint, et cetera?
The answer is yes to all of them. I'm just trying to think which can be shared in open forum here. No, I think as far as the adaptive designs are concerned, as you probably know, FDA is very clear. There are well-defined examples of trials ongoing where sample cells will be modified along the way based on what is actually observed. I also believe within the next 12 months you will see combination approved of 2 unapproved drugs together. Okay, I'll leave it at that, okay? And the question relates to sort of novel endpoints, et cetera. The FDA is trying to be helpful, but I think the pendulum swings, okay? Yesterday, a day before, the ODAC voted 11-0 to approve carfilzomib in multiple myeloma for 22% response rate. That's a disease that's has many active treatments that patients are not exhausted. And yet only 12 months earlier, FDA gave refusal to file to Genentech for TDM1 with 30% response rate in a HER2-positive patient population that had exhausted every HER2-targeted therapy and average of 7 lines of prior therapy. So you know what has happened in these 12 months. Kay Hagan's legislation, breakthrough medicine, Margaret Hamburg getting there saying, guys, we need to get these drugs out. Now Rick Pazder is saying he's expecting 30 NDAs filing this year for oncology for new entities. So I think there's movement in all these angles. I wouldn't jump so far as to sort of take the FDA guidance they just put out, getting adjuvant approval based on new adjuvant CR rate. Yeah, right.
And Christine, I think you brought up, and Mike, I think you've got some experience here, some examples where we've seen people work with disease philanthropy groups, patient advocacy groups in a really positive way, whether it be Kathy Gucci and the work that she's doing with multiple myeloma, cystic fibrosis. Anything, comment you want to make on that?
So we started to work with Susan G. Komen, no surprise there, triple-negative breast cancer companion diagnostic, and we approached them very early, even when we were not funded, to just introduce ourselves. And you know, the patient disease foundations, they are incredible. The knowledge there you find is incredible, and it's also a wonderful source for networking. As far as approval is concerned, they offered us even to come with us to the FDA. We didn't even ask for that, in recognition of the high unmet medical need. And also in recognition, this was prior to the guidelines I mentioned, which were just issued in triple-negative breast cancer for accelerated approval. We are also working with ABC Square. That's a foundation for brain cancer. What I haven't mentioned, our therapies also have applications in pancreatic cancer and glioblastoma. So we're starting very early to work with those foundations, network. There is some funding available too. Funding varies, so it can be small, but it can get you on the road with a secondary indication, like we are doing currently with glioblastoma. I can't disclose the details yet, but it's really very rewarding working with the foundations early.
So if I could just a couple of things to comment on that. So I think foundations are becoming a very interesting play for entrepreneurs today. We started in the 90s with the patient advocacy in HIV and breast cancer, and that was the first generation of advocacy. Somewhat naive, well-intentioned, but somewhat naive. We're going to cure cancer if only we have X billion. It changed as those two areas matured, and then Michael Millikan with Prostate Cancer Foundation. So just to give you different types of examples of how these foundations are working. So Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, for example, can do anything for you as little or as much as you want them to be involved, from just connecting you with people to people who have preclinical models to clinical protocol development issues, you'll run it, and advising on sites, etc. The Sarcoma Consortium, we have just transformed that to not an NCI type of cooperative group, but actually a foundational function like the MMRF can work very collaboratively and flexibly with industry to actually make things happen. But that does mean they won't be as cheap as NCI cooperative group, but you get sort of industry quality studies for much less in rare tumor types that are very hard to do studies on. Okay? Leukemia Lymphoma Society has gone one step further. They are actually willing to invest in drugs and companies, but in return they'll take an equity stake in that company. Very interesting. You would never think a foundation will do that, but we are starting to see that. Yeah. So if you look today, there's no multiple myeloma drug that gets developed without interaction with MMRF. I don't believe there's any prostate cancer drug that gets developed without involvement of Prostate Cancer Foundation. So there is a lot of resources out there. At a minimum, they address the issue that somebody raised in the question last session. It cost me $1,000 for an afternoon of consultancy. These, for at least specific disease areas, and I know Alzheimer's, cystic fibrosis, Parkinson's, all in same sort of thing. You have all the resources available to guide you, and they are not only bringing that, they bring you a strategic perspective, whereby sometimes they'll tell you, you know, other people are way ahead of you. Maybe you ought to give it up now rather than, or join forces with somebody else.
So I think that my experiences with the Leukemia Lymphoma Society and developing products, just as you've said, and have been very successful in bringing products forward very quickly with their cooperation. I personally believe that philanthropic drug development is probably a good portion of the future, just because of the focus that it brings. So, we have stories of, recognizing a program with leukemia, lymphoma, doing all the development work, all the regulatory functions, and then first time in patients in 13 months. So it's a way to jumpstart and expedite, I think, development programs.
And you have a question. And at the Kauffman Foundation, when I arrived 8 years ago, we began getting calls from people like Kathy and others, and have been working with them diligently for the last 8 years. So if anybody needs linkages, let me know. They're right. It's the future.
We have a repurposed drug, and I know the clinical and regulatory strategy is different. Could you comment on that a little bit? We're trying to start phase 2, I think.
Yeah, let's start with Michael. No, Michael, go ahead, please.
So lots of activity around repurposed drugs, and most of the times these programs end up in a 505(b)(2) type of program where you can leverage the existing body of knowledge. So helpful from a speed sort of to approval type of situation, depending on what the repurposing is. You still have to go through the clinical program, but some can be as simple as bioequivalency studies in normal adult volunteers to get approval, and some are much more complex, like the leukemia lymphoma programs that are repurposed for a completely different program. So it's a great way to get a jump on the development program. Chemistry is usually already in place. You can find GMP sources of products, maybe formulations out there that work, and then you can forego some of the preclinical work that may be necessary, and then hopefully an abbreviated clinical program. So it's a good way to go. And in many cases, in repurposed drugs, there's orphan possibilities, so there's exclusivity pathways as well.
So one thing on repurposed drug, to additional thing to bear in mind is, this is the classic case where you really need to know your target product profile. Because if you're going to take a non-cancer drug and develop it for cancer and sell it for $30 a month, it's not going to happen. But I just saw this week, literally at a symposium in Brussels, where there is a drug that's approved for neurological conditions, has real activity in melanoma. Very interesting. Investigators and academic investors asked me, what would you do? I said, first thing is start working with a chemistry company, come up with another analog, because they're already up to phase 2. And you're almost going to destroy your value proposition, A, because you're not working as great as you could if you had an optimized drug. You're limited to dosing that you were doing for neurological condition because you never tested it beyond that. So you have spent 3 years now, treated 50 patients, when if you had been smart up front, said, you know what, let me talk to somebody. Maybe I need to do another phase 1 and give 10 times the dose for oncology. Or maybe I need to really understand biology a little bit more. So I just caution a little bit that if you're repurposing, then the proof of concept is different. Because you probably already know the drug is going to work for that indication, but your real proof of concept is, what is the target product profile I need to support my commercial case? And in order to get the target product profile, what do I need to change this drug to? And if it's the same drug, same dose, no issue with there, you can only rely on a 7-year exclusive data exclusivity. You might get 5 to 12, depending on where you are. But I would look carefully at repurposing and make sure that the repurposed drug is still the right drug for the new indication, and that you have enough of a commercial case at the end that somebody along the way will pay you for it.
And I would tell you this is probably one of the hottest topics on the market right now. Don Frail, who used to run drug repositioning for Pfizer, now AstraZeneca, just mailed me his book last week that was just published, although it's wildly expensive, but I would tell you it's awesome and has lots of history. And there's, I think, Todd at Michael J. Fox has at least 3 he's looking at. Leukemia and lymphoma has 2 that they're looking at. And it's another great example of, if you're going to do this, go find the disease philanthropist that's going to partner with you, because the discussion relative to how are we going to get paid and how are we going to get this on the market is equally as difficult as what is the regulatory pathway. And if you don't have a smart person with you, you're going to make some mistakes, and unfortunately, it's not going to work. So, good.
I always want to throw something positive out. So we heard sort of, we heard sort of the pitfalls, and I agree with them. But you might be familiar with a program which the NIH launched called Trend. They are looking at repurposing drugs, and you can approach them and have a discussion. And please don't be shy. I just had actually a couple of discussions with the NIH team on other subjects. They also launched NCATS, which looks at translational medicine. So if you have a good case, you might be able to have the NIH actually fund your development. So that's one consideration.
So just something to add. I don't disagree with that. You can do it, but some of the most challenging discussions I've had have been with NCI, with drugs that are off patent or multiple drugs that pharma killed. Say, look, NCI, this drug works for this niche patient population and works spectacularly well for some patients. Why don't you take it in actually and take it, because we know the phase 2 is done, efficacy is there, 1 trial and you'll be on the market, and we know the FDA will say no. I will not say no to it. So the NCI answer always is, but you know what? NCI is not in the business of commercializing drugs. Unless you can find me a commercial partner, NCI doesn't want to take it on. It's quite remarkable, actually, and I give them credit for being realistic, actually, because otherwise we are getting to a healthcare model where NCI is a central pharmacy distributor of these drugs for niche indications.
Hi, I have a very fundamental kind of question about strategy. So say you have a product, it has very compelling preclinical data, and the question is how you can build additional values so you can attract the revenue to eventually continue your clinical development. So the options that have been proposed to me are, well, you need a large animal model, or you need to instead go into first in human outside the US, versus obviously the largest challenge would be a clinical trial inside the US. So I guess what I'm interested in hearing from you is, what is the value of the outside the US clinical trial, since it doesn't seem like it's going to necessarily be useful for a subsequent PMA application to the FDA? Is it solely to attract venture capital funds? Or, I mean, because I always thought that the concept of proof in humans would essentially resolve these clinical efficacy and some of the toxicity issues, and that would be a very compelling argument no matter where those humans were geographically located.
So I think it is not true that trials done outside the US are not acceptable to the FDA at any stage. As long as the trials are done with GCP, data verifiable trials are acceptable. One thing I sort of detected in your question that I want to push back a little bit, that saving costs on doing the necessary preclinical toxicology work or efficacy work is probably not a good reason to go ex-US. Generally speaking, there is no requirement that you have to do your tox study or efficacy in higher animal species unless it's a biological where monkey is the only animal with the right specificity profile and the cross-reactivity of the drug. And that is a running problem with biologics. So if you're in that type of situation, it's more a case-by-case discussion. There are primate facilities elsewhere in the world which can do it cheaper than the few in the US. But I'm always loath to give advice, cut corners on safety and go trial ex-US because somebody will let you do it. When something bad happens, believe me, there'll be no defense.
Yeah, and I think there's a big difference between cutting corners and taking sort of a minimalistic approach to development. There's a significant difference, and I think that you have to always be aware of that. And that's why I mentioned earlier that if you're going to go outside of the U.S., you may want to bring the FDA into the process with an IND in the U.S. so that they can be involved and you sort of maybe harmonize across the global development piece.
Hi, so with the highly personalized medicine and the companion diagnostics really honing in on your target, what do you think the likelihood of regulatory agencies approving a drug based on a pathway approach as opposed to an indication approach? So if you have a really clean profile, a really specific drug target, why do 6 different oncology trials and 6 different indications when you can just do potentially in one that has that particular mutation that you're going after?
So, okay, so I'll take that. So I think it's the latter, second part of your question, the answer is we are not there yet. We won't be there for a while. And as much as someone who works in industry, I love to see drugs start getting approved on pathways rather than individual tumor type. I don't think biology is there yet. Herceptin doesn't work the same as, for that 4% HER2 positive lung cancer, 2% colon cancer, 8% prostate cancer, as it does for breast cancer. Mutant BRAF inhibitor from Plexicon works great for melanoma, not so for BRAF mutated colon cancer. So I think as industry, we have to be careful not to push it too far. When something wrong happens, the pendulum will swing all the way back. Progress is starting to happen in this area where at least first registration a tumor type, then across a spectrum of rare tumors with that specific target, the FDA is a bit more open to treating them at least in one trial and then along the way seeing where the efficacy is. So, so that's my perspective on it.
So I agree, we're not there yet from a regulatory perspective, but from a strategic perspective, to your point, you might have opportunities to tease something out early on in development. In fact, we just got feedback from our scientific advisory board for our first in-human trial, not just to, in a phase 1A situation, not just to enroll breast cancer patients which have a high DESPER target expression. DESPER is the name of our target. But also be opportunistic and enroll pancreatic cancer patients and glioblastoma patients. There's a very nice story about the ALK inhibitor from Pfizer. You're aware of what happened there in phase 1. They got complete response in 3 lung cancer patients. Originally, Pfizer was targeting a completely different indication. And they took the 3 tumors basically where they obtained complete response and sent them to Harvard to sequence the tumor. They found the ALK mutation and then changed their entire indication strategy and developed a companion diagnostic. And the product is approved and supposedly works in 7% of all lung cancers. So that's actually a beautiful example how pathway could drive your indication strategy if you're opportunistic and you can integrate it into your development.
Hi, I was hoping you could give me at least some feedback on this situation that we find ourselves in. So our company is developing a second generation product of a first to market product. So the predicate technology, if approved, will be the first type of treatment in oncology. We have been talking about our value proposition is, however successful that first product is, we have designed the second generation product to be even more successful. And so I'm kind of have difficulty wrapping my head around or picturing what the regulatory pathway for that is, because I picture my phase 2 and phase 3 trials, the FDA is going to make me target people who have already failed the predicate technology. And that's a situation I don't really want to get into. And I'm just trying to envision how to get around that, or if that's the only pathway I have. So.
Which therapeutic area are you in?
Yeah, you can't be this big.
We're,
you want an answer.
oncolytic viruses.
Okay, if you're in the oncology space, yes, it's because other therapeutic areas, as you know, you don't have to compare yourself to the first generation compound or head-to-head or failed population. Oncology is you're generally held to that standard for good reason. But as you know, the oncology paradigm and our clinical investigators are completely in tune with that as to how to identify patients to benefit from the next generation technology. And I suspect you will find, if you can't show me your drug works in patients who have failed a first generation drug or not responded to it, then you probably don't have a better drug. So I'm not worried so much about the phase 3 trial here. I'm worried about proof of concept. Just at the ASCO meeting, since we just used the ALK example, so Pfizer ALK antagonist works in objective response at 58%, 70, 80% disease control rate. Novartis just showed their phase 1 data at ASCO meeting, 81% response rate in patients who had failed the Pfizer ALK antagonist, 81 patients. And that's specific mutation, that patient just failed, new drug, including activity in brain metastasis. So after 30 patients, if this drug was coming from a small biotech and I'm helping a big pharma, like I said, take this drug, no brainer, and you'll get a ton of. So I think the key is you have to really look at it. If you really believe your product is differentiated, you should be able to show activity either in patients that failed the other drug or some sort of superiority in a head-to-head phase 2 comparison.
Well, I think, sure. Just on a sort of regulatory pathway point of view, I mean, you'll have a fairly complete development and approval package. But the good news is you have a Me Too product that you can kind of see what the roadmap was initially. So that should be helpful.
On that, and then I'll come up to him, but since he's kind of on this topic, and one of the questions, that were topics for discussion here was thinking about who are your partners or stakeholder management, especially as it relates to you're going to be working with CROs and others. Any advice you have to give him on this topic? Because he's going to need it.
Well, I think that really the most effective small development companies and drug companies that I've seen are the ones that are able to put together teams of experts that you can expand your reach and your leverage. So I think it goes back to the good advice and good counsel. And I think on managing CROs and making sure you're getting what you need in a timely fashion, I think that's a skill all in itself, and you need to have some expertise on staff. I mean, all the CROs will tell you that, yes, we can do it for you, it's a turnkey, come back and pick up the report in a couple of years and everything will be great, but it just doesn't happen that way. And it's just completely active management. When you don't get your recruitment rates, what kind of early warning signals are you going to be able to use? What are regulatory issues with various sites that, GCP kinds of things. There are many, many moving parts, and I think the mistake that some small companies make is trying to manage all that sort of by themselves. So.
Well, and I think
I think CROs are probably one of the bigger challenges actually for small companies, because the big CROs won't give you the time of the day. They say they will, but they won't. They got major strategic alliances with big pharma. I think we had about 1,000 people working at Covance just on Roche projects. So effectively, they became Roche employees. They were just working at Covance, right? So small biotechs have consistently complained they won't get the traction. There are a couple of things to think about. One is you go to more boutique CROs that are more specialty focused, number one. Secondly, since it sounds like you're very early, by and large, phase 1 trials you're not going to do at more than 2 or 3 sites. Maybe you want to consider CRO just as a way to get the tools part done efficiently, rapid case report form preparations, a few other things for the sites. And one thing I would never outsource, since you're working specifically in oncology, for a phase 1 trial, I would never outsource medical monitoring to CRO. Especially when you have a complicated therapeutic modality. CROs are great for phase 3 trials, by the way, or phase 2 trial involving 20 sites. CROs are not great for phase 1 trial of 4 sites. Use them for the toolkits and those type of resources, but really run the trial yourself. Even if you need contract help, medical oncology, etc., that's fine.
Another practical advice, even if you get the right CRO and you have a great team who have worked with CROs before and you're all happy, you have to think, especially in oncology, about can you get the patients? I'll give you one example. In glioblastoma, there are currently 225 clinical trials registered, and the yearly incidence, if I remember that correctly, is about 17,000 patients. So you have to be aware of that. And again, I want to throw out disease foundations there. We actually, for Taurus Biomedical, we worked with 2 foundations in the field of interstitial cystitis. They know the patients. We had very, very fast enrollment, and that was largely due to the fact in working with those foundations. You know, they connected us with patients, so we had no problems, and we had a nice boutique CRO as well. So that concept works very well together.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, to put the discussions together that we've had the last 2 days, I mean, you need to spend a lot of time on your founding team. Who is it? Be careful. You need to spend a lot of time on your, who's doing your intellectual property. Be careful. It could kill you. And you need to spend a lot of time on this topic. Who's going to take this baby forward? Who's going to be your medical monitors? And a significant amount of your budget is lost in cycle time of trying to recruit patients. And so ultimately, if you can get disease philanthropists who, I mean, in the case of cystic fibrosis as an example, or even Kathy, I mean, they literally own that patient population. So if you want to go fast, and you have to go through them, ultimately.
Yeah, I think one other thing to be aware of is as you move forward on these things, you want to be careful you don't fall into a trap of thinking that you can find these kinds of things at an academic research center. Sometimes you can. I'm not saying that you can't, but I think there are more examples of slow enrollment rates in academic centers where companies have kind of fallen into the trap that, well, I can get it cheaper and faster and so on, and we're still waiting for some of those to come out.
My question revolves around this paradigm that biotech companies, especially in oncology, talk about de-risking the program. And more specifically, the question is that I think somebody was asking from the back of the room that they want to go first in human. And the value of phase 1 and de-risking the program. So a lot of times there is the idea that if we have phase 1 data, it will be better than preclinical. If we have phase 2 data, it's better than phase 1. But I think the challenge in oncology especially is that if you do phase 1, there's really not much of value because healthy volunteers don't really count because people are dying from cancer. FDA is more worried about providing efficacy, and if your phase 1 is not properly designed, you really don't get much of the efficacy data, so you're primarily looking for safety. I wonder if you guys have any view on that, and primarily in the context of raising money and the fact that most biotechs are always constrained of the money and they're looking for next inflection point.
It's a very interesting question, actually. I think oncology phase 1 is where the landscape has changed the biggest over the last 8 years, okay? So it really depends on what type of drug candidates you have. We have gone from sort of 80-90% drugs being cytotoxic to probably 60% being so-called targeted drugs. And increasingly with targeted drugs, you do a phase 1 in all comers like Christine was describing, and then you put these enriched tails, and you're starting to see 200 patient phase 1. Effectively, the goal today is with the targeted drugs at least, that most of you, I believe, will be working on. By the end of phase 1, you get to your mini phase 2 readout. And don't think it's not a big value inflection. Just look at the market cap for pharmacyclics and what BioVex and Micromet sold for, Seattle Genetics market cap, etc. So I'm not saying that's what you should look for, because part of doing that will also be if you don't see efficacy, you're dead. Because now somebody has concluded, hey, you treated 20 patients, you've already excluded with a statistical significance, you don't have 50% response rate, so your company is finished.
So just to clarify that, what you are suggesting is more like phase 1 and 2A.
We don't, it's not really 2A because they're treating 15 patients, more a pilot phase 2.
Okay.
But increasingly, because of this 12-month white space between phases, we all struggle with that. Industry has come to 12-month white space, and increased the way academia functions these days. One, we are struggling to reduce that time. With targeted therapy, my goal is straightforward. Phase 1 with a tail, get to 40-50% response in whatever refractory failed population that you're describing, and I'm going to pivotal trial. But then I'm taking a conscious risk. If I don't hit that, very likely my value inflection just went down. For some people, it may make sense to consider getting a major partnership pre-IND stage. And just look at what Celgene has done with a variety of alliances they have done. So I think this game has changed from a one-size-fits-all game to very much where big pharma is willing to pay hundreds of millions at the end of phase 1 tail if efficacy is good, all the way back where sometimes at platform stage you can get deal, maybe 5 million upfront, but 100 million in research funding. So that bookends it. Not everything is that lucrative, but it does bookend it for you.
Other questions? Oh, I'm sorry. And I know I heard yesterday that people didn't get enough opportunity to talk or to have questions relative to funding. So obviously, if you want to talk about partnerships, these are the people to talk about partnerships with when you're thinking about even your clinical strategy. So go ahead.
I think I might have the right question for the topic because essentially what I have is a lead concept with some in vitro data, some mice data for a immune enhancer potentially applicable for human vaccines, broader platform, I mean, changing from oncology towards biologics and vaccines. That's all I have right now. So I'm looking for all those company formation and things we didn't really talk about. What do you suggest from your perspective, taking that from that stage to an IND, and how fast I can go, what I have to do? Give me a flow chart, give me directions, turns, speed limits.
I don't envy you. You have an immunomodulator where it's shown immune modulation in mouse. That's probably the worst place to be. Because we know...
Give it to him tough.
Because if there is one place mouse doesn't tell us much about human biology, it's immune response. So you will be considered a high-risk project. I don't know the specific, maybe somebody else wants to comment if this is generally a positive path forward, but this becomes very specific, what indication you're going for, and does the mouse immune modulation in any way tell us much about what will happen in humans in that indication?
But I guess, it's all about the inflection point. So you hear this, and how do you build the value, and what are you gonna, first I always tell our clients that, you have to prove the science to yourself first so that you believe in it, and then you can explain it to whoever the partners might be. So I think you have to build value.
Another consideration is, I'm not going to go into the mouse thing, although I agree with you, independent replication. In other words, have you collaborated with another lab? And sometimes there can be another academic institution as well. The rules are changing there as well. I think it's very important that you should be able to demonstrate that another independent party can have the same scientific findings. That's very important as you go through this process and build a company and a strategy.
So I think what you'll have to do is look at more indirect ways of convincing people that what you're doing will translate into people. So if your immunomodulation pathway, you're hitting a certain pathway, there's another agent in another target in the same pathway, which has been shown to do something meaningful in people in the context of vaccination or any other form of immune response, or being involved in autoimmune diseases as a causative pathway. Those can be the indirect sort of inferences to say, this guy is working on the right target or right pathway, even though these are mouse immune response data. Let's see if we can build on it.
So another question for you guys. Could you talk about, I'm an entrepreneur. Many people in this room, as an example, are going to say, I'm an entrepreneur. I have this technology, however early I am. What's my go, no-go decision relative to, do I continue to go down this road and simply look as my exit to license, or am I building a company? Could you talk about that and what because I've always worried that entrepreneurs really want to create a company. In many cases, they shouldn't be creating a company.
Christine? You've been very successful at creating.
So she'll give you the good news.
So, couple of considerations. First, on a macro level, in a current financing environment, even if you've done it before, you raised a lot of capital before, you know all the venture capitalists in town, if you, or outside of town, if you want to build an integrated pharmaceutical company, it requires a lot of capital. So right now, in the current economic environment, the odds are a little bit against you. There are far more entrepreneurs asking for capital, and at the same time, if you look at the Q1 WPC venture capital financing data, I think the dollars are down something like 60% in biotech. Deals are down 43. I hope I didn't flip those rates, but it's pretty bad. No news there. So you have to consider that, just from a macro level. On a micro level, in terms of, and I call it the intrinsic factors of an entrepreneur, maybe if you do this for the first time, other than doing the usual things in terms of formalizing your funding strategy, that has to be in line with your business model. You have to set yourself a time point. Talk to fellow entrepreneurs, set yourself realistic time points versus milestones from a financing perspective, i.e., I give myself 6 to 8 months to raise a seed, and here are my arguments, my milestones, etc., and then reevaluate if you do not hit that milestone. That's very, very important, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't do that. Maybe you have a good argument to extend the milestone, but it's important to set that and maybe also to decide if being an entrepreneur is for you. There is nothing wrong with saying, this is maybe not my area. It's a very, very distinct field. And I personally have no problems with entrepreneurs who turn around and say, being out there raising capital all the time is not for me. I go back to academia or I go back to big pharma. That's okay. And whilst you're doing that, consider what you're doing with the asset. You might have an opportunity to give it, to license it out, to offer it to different entrepreneurs. In certain cases, it goes back to the university. That's determined by your license. But be very milestone driven, even in that process. I know that's very hard, but that helps.
Hi. Talking about mice a little earlier, I'm engaged in a field called HIV vaccines that have consumed $13 billion of Gates Foundation money as well as government money. And next 10 years, we don't expect to have a licensable product. Given that at a conference on HIV vaccine, there was a very nice quote that mice tell lies about, I'm talking strictly of HIV vaccine, mice tell lies, monkeys don't tell the truth. The ultimate truth emerges from limited human clinical trials. And this is true for HIV vaccine and perhaps true of some of the molecules or some of the drugs that are safe to do a very limited trial on 1 to 10 patients at most.
I think your point is well made, especially for immunotherapies. We have struggled with animal models for sure. And this is one of the reasons why the FDA opened up the path to exploratory IND phase 0 studies, that if something is really, really safe and you're absolutely sure no harm will come on it, pilot studies, minimal toxicology, that's for biological and frankly even for small molecules. All sorts of microdosing studies paradigm in phase 0s. I think those are perfectly legitimate things to do as long as the entrepreneur has a realistic expectation of where they will be at the end of it. For societal good, for sure, absolutely no issue with that, but the entrepreneur should understand where that goes. So I have absolutely nothing against doing that. I think it's perfectly fine for certain drug categories, therapeutic categories, certain therapeutic areas for sure.
So I'd like to close with good news. And so I have a little game for the panelists to play, and I'll do mine first. I think we all have an example in our lives of entrepreneurs that we for sure did not think were going to make it and did. I can give you mine because he's here and he's been on one of the earlier panels. He's been on 2 panels, as a matter of fact, and I for sure never thought he was going to make it when I met him 8 years ago. And he'd never done it before, had been a doc, and didn't know what reimbursement meant when we had our first meeting. And he's now sold his first company to Novartis and is on to number 2 and 3. So it does happen. So I'll give it to you guys to use you examples.
I thought I would never going to make it. When I did my first company, Taurus, the feedback you get as a first-time CEO from venture capital is just horrible. No matter how many drugs you commercialized, how many drugs you took through development. So just stick with it, but set yourself a time point. And look, I made it.
So I look at entrepreneurial companies and their founders as a group of people that wants to cross the river, but they have to run across the river on the backs of alligators or crocodiles. And I guess the thing is, try not to slip,
And I thought Christine wasn't going to make it.
Okay, unless we have any final questions. One more? No? Okay. I want to thank the panelists for sharing their expertise with us.